On a brutal February night in 1838, 17-year-old Eliza Monroe was dragged through a Louisiana blizzard toward the plantation's icehouse, where her master, Jonathan Whitaker, planned to lock her inside as punishment for what he called uppity behavior. But when that heavy wooden door slammed shut, it wasn't Eliza who found herself trapped in the frozen tomb. By sunrise, the entire Whitaker family lay dead in their own icehouse. Eliza vanished into the storm, leaving behind only a rusty key hanging from the latch, and whispers of the ice witch of Louisiana that would haunt the region for generations. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The Whitaker plantation sprawled across over 4,000 acres of Louisiana Delta bottomland, its manor house rising like a white monument to wealth built on human suffering. Jonathan Whitaker had inherited the property from his grandfather, along with nearly 200 enslaved souls, and a reputation for cruelty that made even his fellow planters uncomfortable during their polished social gatherings. His wife, Evelyn, possessed the delicate beauty of porcelain and twice its fragility, compensating for her physical weakness with a tongue sharp enough to cut bone. Their 3 children had soaked up their parents' casual brutality like sponges drinking spilled wine. 12-year-old Henry showed early promise as a future overseer, delighting in inventing new punishments for slaves who displeased him. 10-year-old twins Charlotte and Daniel competed to see who could inflict the cruelest psychological torment on house servants, treating human beings like toys that existed solely for their amusement. Eliza Monroe had been born into this hell during a bitter winter. Her mother died in childbirth, and her father was worked to death in the cotton fields under the lash of an overseer. She grew up in the slave quarters under the watchful care of old Sarah, the plantation's cook, and the unofficial mother of dozens of orphan children, their parents sold away or buried in unmarked graves. It was Sarah who secretly taught Eliza to read using scraps of newspapers and discarded Bible pages. Literacy for a slave was forbidden, punishable by mutilation or worse, yet Eliza's hunger for learning was impossible to contain. She memorized every overheard conversation, every glance at the plantation's records, building a detailed understanding of how the Whitaker estate functioned and where its weaknesses might lie. By 15, Eliza had been moved from the fields to house service, exposing her daily to the Whitakers' refined brutality. She witnessed Jonathan's drunken rages, Evelyn's calculated psychological torture, and the children's gleeful participation in the plantation's reign of terror. Every day reminded her she was property, not person, an object to be used, abused, and discarded at her owner's whim. The winter of 1838 arrived early and merciless, coating the Louisiana Delta in ice and turning the great Mississippi into a frozen artery that trapped steamboats and isolated towns for weeks. The Whitaker plantation's icehouse, carved into the side of a hill behind the main house, became a vital stronghold. Jonathan ordered it filled to capacity with massive blocks cut from the river, creating a crystalline fortress where meat and dairy could last through the season. For Eliza, the icehouse became both her torment and her refuge. Assigned to icehouse duty as punishment for what Evelyn called impertinent behavior, Eliza endured endless hours in that sub-zero chamber, rearranging supplies until her fingers went numb and her breath fogged the air. Her crime had been little more than allowing her disgust to show when young Henry tortured a kitten for amusement. The work was backbreaking, and her thin cotton dress offered no protection against the bone-deep cold. Yet within the icehouse, away from constant surveillance, she found something she had never known in 17 years of bondage: solitude. There she could think, she could plan. She began stashing small items in hidden crevices, bits of food, scraps of cloth, tools, and emergency cash should the opportunity for escape ever come. Jonathan often checked her work, prowling around her like a predator, his breath reeking of whiskey, his gray eyes glinting with cruelty. Sometimes his inspections included hands that wandered where they had no right to go, accompanied by whispered threats about what became of slave girls who resisted. Evelyn's punishments were subtler but no less ruthless. She deliberately sent Eliza to the icehouse on the coldest days, watching her return with blue lips and shaking limbs before commenting with false sweetness on how the cold brought out her color. The Whitaker children joined in with gleeful malice. Henry shoved Eliza hard enough against the wall to leave bruises, while Charlotte and Daniel whispered lurid tales of captured runaways burned or beaten beyond recognition, their eyes shining as they described her hypothetical fate. It was cruelty turned into a family game. Still, Eliza's mind worked. She noticed patterns. Jonathan drank more each evening, stumbling to bed in a stupor. Evelyn relied on laudanum to numb her nerves. And the children, for all their sharp tongues, were still children. easily frightened when confronted with forces they could not control. The stage for Eliza's defiance was set by the storm of February 14th, the worst blizzard the region had seen in living memory. Winds screamed like banshees, tearing shingles from roofs, while temperatures plummeted 20 degrees below freezing. The Whitakers huddled by the parlor fire that evening, sipping brandy, discussing their plans for the week, and finalizing their cruel design for Eliza's punishment. They decided she would be locked overnight in the icehouse, with nothing but her cotton dress, stripped of shawl and shoes to maximize her agony. If she survived, she might learn proper gratitude. If she died, Jonathan said flatly, she could be replaced at the next Natchez slave market. The children giggled with anticipation, already imagining how they would boast about the slave girl who froze to death on their family's land. They thought it a story fit for polite dinner conversation. But Eliza had her own story forming in silence, one that would turn their frozen tomb against them. That night, as the storm howled outside, Jonathan Whitaker declared it was time to teach the girl her place. Bundled in heavy coats and boots, the family left the comfort of their parlor and trudged through knee-deep snow toward the icehouse. Their lanterns cast jagged shadows on the trees, flickering as the wind tried to snuff out the flames. The frozen ground crunched beneath their boots, each step a drumbeat toward what they believed would be Eliza's torment. Inside, the chamber was a tomb of stone and ice. Frost clung to the walls, the air so cold it burned with each breath. Jonathan shoved Eliza toward the center, his voice booming with satisfaction as he explained that she would spend the night here, barefoot and shivering, while the family returned to their warm beds. Evelyn stepped forward with a cruel smile and removed Eliza's thin shawl, declaring that warmth must be earned by obedience. Henry smirked and clapped his hands while the twins bounced with excitement, whispering that they wanted to hear her screams carried on the wind. But Eliza did not scream. She stood quietly, her dark eyes steady, her breathing calm. When Jonathan turned toward the door, preparing to seal her inside, Eliza spoke for the first time that night. Her voice was soft but clear, asking whether the family was certain they would make it safely back through the storm. The temperature was falling fast, she said, and even thick coats might not protect them for long. Jonathan blinked in surprise, thrown off by her tone of genuine concern. Evelyn laughed, brushing away the remark with icy scorn. They were masters, after all, wrapped in wool and fur, destined for the safety of their fire-lit home. She told Eliza she would be the only one to freeze. In that moment, Eliza's plan unfolded. As Jonathan placed his hand on the heavy wooden door, she lunged forward with startling speed. With one swift movement, she slipped past them, shoved the door shut, and dropped the iron key into the lock from the outside. The sound of the bolt sliding into place echoed like thunder. Inside, the Whitakers cried out in disbelief. Jonathan pounded the door with his fists, roaring with rage. Evelyn's voice rose, shrill with both command and pleading, promising mercy if Eliza returned. The children shrieked, their voices cracking with panic as the air grew colder, their bravado shattered in an instant. But Eliza did not return. She wrapped herself in Jonathan's own fur-lined coat, taken earlier and hidden away, and clutched the canvas bag she had prepared in secret. With every step she took back toward the manor, the Whitakers' cries grew fainter, swallowed by wind and stone. She did not feel joy, nor did she feel pity. What she felt was resolve, a clarity forged by years of cruelty and sharpened by the storm. Tonight, the weapon meant to destroy her would become the grave of her oppressors. The main house loomed in silence as she entered. The enslaved people in their quarters remained unaware of the chaos, still asleep in the frozen night, believing their masters safe in their beds. Moving through the rooms like a ghost, Eliza gathered what she needed. From Jonathan's study, she stole coins and paper money. From Evelyn's wardrobe, she claimed warm clothing and sturdy boots. From the children's rooms, she took trinkets and small valuables she could sell along the way. Then in the plantation's record room, she opened the ledgers and carefully altered the documents. With the literacy Sarah had risked everything to teach her, Eliza transformed herself on paper from enslaved property to freed woman, forging the name Elizabeth Washington onto official-looking records that could pass casual inspection. All the while she could still hear it, the muffled shouts carried faintly on the wind, the Whitakers fighting desperately against their fate in the frozen chamber. But by then their cries were weaker, more frantic, less human. Eliza understood the cold was already stripping them of reason, wrapping their limbs in numbness and fogging their minds with delirium. By dawn, their screams would fade to silence. Before the first light of dawn, Eliza made her way to the plantation stables, the icy wind cutting across the yard like blades. Inside the warm stalls, Jonathan Whitaker's prized mare, a sleek black horse named Tempest, stamped her hooves against the straw. Eliza had tended this horse before, brushing her coat, feeding her oats, whispering gentle words while the Whitaker children yanked her reins with careless cruelty. Tempest knew her voice, and when Eliza placed a steady hand on her neck, the animal nickered softly, accepting her as if it had always been this way. She saddled Tempest quickly, securing her hoarded supplies: bread, salted meat, a flask of water, stolen coins, and the forged papers that now bore her new identity. Wrapping herself tightly in the heavy fur coat, she mounted, gripping the reins with trembling hands. The storm was still fierce, snow sweeping across the fields in white sheets, but Eliza guided Tempest with confidence. She had memorized routes from Jonathan's conversations and maps glimpsed in his study. He had never noticed her sharp memory, nor imagined that she would turn his own knowledge against him. As the first rays of sunlight touched the frozen land, Eliza rode away from the only home she had ever known. Behind her, smoke curled from the chimneys of the slave quarters, where her people awoke to another day of endless toil, unaware that the Whitakers were sealed in their own tomb. The icehouse stood silent and unyielding, a prison of Jonathan's own making, its thick stone walls already holding the last breath of the family that had wielded so much power. The road toward Natchez stretched before her like a ribbon of possibility. Tempest's hooves struck sparks against frozen ground, carrying Eliza farther with each stride. Her heart pounded not from fear but from a strange exhilaration. She was no longer running within the boundaries of the Whitaker estate, but fleeing into the unknown, guided by courage and necessity. She kept her forged documents close, the name Elizabeth Washington already settling into her mind as if she had been born to it. By midday she had traveled more than 30 miles, following back roads and wooded trails that concealed her passage. She rested Tempest by a stream glazed with ice, feeding her bits of grain stolen from the stable, and reviewed her papers by the dim light that broke through the clouds. Every detail mattered: the handwriting, the signatures, the copied seals. It was not perfection, but it was close enough to fool most eyes. Her survival depended on these papers and her ability to carry herself with the calm authority of a free woman. As the storm eased that afternoon, she pressed onward. Her destination was Natchez, where she planned to sell Tempest discreetly, purchase passage northward on a riverboat, and vanish into free territory. The plan was simple, but Eliza knew the smallest misstep could end it all. One glance from the wrong man, one question answered poorly, one flash of recognition of Tempest's distinctive coat, and her life would be over. Still, she rode forward, the bitter wind stinging her face, her mind steady with the thought that each mile behind her was another mile between herself and the icebound corpses of the Whitakers. By the second morning of her journey, Eliza reached the outskirts of Natchez. The city rose from the Mississippi's edge like a bustling organism, its streets alive with merchants, travelers, steamboat crews, and carriages rattling over frozen cobblestones. The docks bustled with ships loading cotton bales and unloading barrels of manufactured goods from New Orleans. To an enslaved girl who had only glimpsed the world beyond the plantation and fragments of overheard conversations, the sight was both terrifying and electrifying. Here freedom and danger walked side by side. Eliza kept her chin high, her forged papers tucked securely in her travel bag, and her hands tight on Tempest's reins. She reminded herself of the role she must now embody: Elizabeth Washington, a freed woman from New Orleans traveling north to join relatives. The key to survival was confidence. No overseer, no traitor, no passerby could suspect she was anything less than who her documents claimed she was. Yet as she rode deeper into the city, she felt eyes linger on her horse. Tempest was no ordinary mare. Her sleek black coat and strong build were well known in the region. Jonathan Whitaker had boasted about her endlessly, racing her against other planters' horses, parading her through gatherings. To arrive in Natchez riding such a distinctive animal was like carrying a sign that screamed her connection to the Whitakers. If anyone recognized the horse, questions would follow, and Eliza's fragile disguise would unravel in an instant. She made her way to a modest livery stable on the city's edge, its wooden sign creaking in the wind: horses bought and sold, fair prices paid. The proprietor, a middle-aged man with rough hands and clear eyes, looked up from his work as Eliza approached. His surprise was visible. Such a fine horse under the command of a young black woman was not a sight he expected. But instead of sneering, his tone was respectful. "What can I do for you, miss?" Eliza dismounted gracefully, steadying her voice as she delivered the story she had rehearsed countless times during her ride. Tempest, she explained, was a gift from her former master in New Orleans, a token of gratitude for years of faithful service. Now she needed to sell the animal to finance her journey northward. The stable owner examined Tempest carefully, running his hands along her legs, checking her teeth, noting her perfect condition. His eyes betrayed admiration, but also caution. Such a recognizable animal could attract unwanted attention. At last, he made an offer. $180 in gold coins, less than the mare's full worth, but more than enough to finance Eliza's passage. More importantly, the transaction would be quiet. The man promised discretion, noting that he had a buyer up the river who wanted a horse like Tempest and would not ask questions. Relief surged through Eliza as she accepted. She left the stable with a pouch of gold heavier than anything she had ever held in her life, each coin representing a step further from bondage. Walking through Natchez now on her own feet, she felt both vulnerable and liberated. Every corner of the city pulsed with possibility. Hotels where she might secure a room, ticket offices where steamboats prepared for departure, shops selling clothing and supplies. Yet she also knew slave catchers prowled these same streets, their eyes scanning for fugitives. Her forged documents would be tested soon. The challenge was not merely to survive, but to pass unnoticed in a world where every stranger could be judge, jury, and captor. The Mississippi waterfront was a frenzy of activity. Steamboats belched black smoke into the gray winter sky, their paddle wheels slapping the icy water as dockhands shouted orders and hauled crates aboard. Eliza walked carefully through the crowd, her bag clutched close, the pouch of gold hidden deep inside her coat. She studied the vessels one by one, searching for the right choice. Too luxurious a boat, and her presence would draw suspicion. Too shabby, and the risk of delay or inspection grew higher. She settled on a medium-sized steamer called the River Belle, scheduled to depart the following morning for St. Louis. The vessel was sturdy but not ostentatious, respectable without being exclusive. Its decks bustled with passengers of every class, merchants carrying goods, families seeking new lives upriver, laborers bound for northern towns. Eliza knew she could disappear into such a crowd. Approaching the ticket office, her heart hammered as the clerk, a balding man with a brisk manner, asked for her papers. With steady hands, she produced the documents she had forged in the Whitaker study. Elizabeth Washington, a freedwoman from New Orleans, traveling north to visit relatives. The clerk scanned them briefly, his attention more focused on her coins than her identity. When she counted out the fare in gold, his expression softened into indifference. Money spoke louder than suspicion. He handed her a ticket for second-class passage and moved on to the next customer without a second glance. That night, Eliza found lodging in a modest boarding house near the river. The room was small but clean, with a real bed and fresh linens, luxuries she had never experienced. For the first time in her life, she slept without fear of being woken by commands, punishments, or grasping hands. Yet even in safety, her dreams were troubled. In them, she heard Jonathan pounding on the icehouse door, Evelyn's shrill demands, the twins crying in terror. She woke before dawn with sweat freezing on her skin, the memory of their voices clinging like frost. When morning came, she joined the line of passengers boarding the River Belle. Crew members glanced at her papers, saw her ticket, and waved her aboard with little interest. She found her place among the second-class accommodations, a narrow bunk in a cabin shared with other travelers. The noise of the engines, the chatter of strangers, and the creaking of wood against river water surrounded her, but to Eliza it was the sound of possibility. Each turn of the paddle wheels carried her farther from Louisiana, farther from the Whitakers, farther from the life she had been born into. For several days she kept her head down, speaking little, watching the riverbank slide by. She studied the passengers, families, merchants, workers, careful never to appear curious or afraid. Most ignored her, accepting her presence as unremarkable. But on the fourth day, her blood ran cold. Sitting near the dining area, she overheard two plantation owners in conversation. They spoke of recent news from Louisiana. The Whitaker family had been found dead in their icehouse, frozen together in what authorities described as a tragic accident. Worse still, they mentioned a missing slave girl from the plantation, a house servant who had vanished the very same night. A reward had already been offered for her capture, and professional slave catchers were combing the region. Eliza forced her expression to remain calm, her eyes fixed on her plate, while inside her heart pounded so violently she feared others might hear it. The hunters would not stop at Louisiana's border. If anyone suspected her, her forged documents would not withstand close scrutiny. Her freedom hung by a thread, stretched thinner with every mile. The River Belle reached St. Louis on a gray March morning. Smoke from its chimneys joined the haze of an industrial city alive with commerce. The waterfront teemed with activity. Wagons creaked under loads of goods. Porters shouted for space, and immigrants hurried past with children and bundles of belongings. To Eliza, the city was overwhelming, a cacophony of sound and movement unlike anything she had known. Yet it was also a kind of shield. In a place so crowded she could vanish. Disembarking with the other passengers, Eliza kept her forged papers close and her pouch of coins hidden deep in her clothing. She moved with the quiet confidence of a woman accustomed to travel, reminding herself that hesitation would be her enemy. Here, nobody knew her face. Nobody could trace the cries of the Whitakers back to her. If she carried herself as Elizabeth Washington, free woman, then that was who she would become. Within days, she found work in a dressmaking shop owned by a German immigrant named Mrs. Richter. The shop, tucked into a busy street near the heart of the city, was filled with bolts of fabric and the steady hum of sewing machines. Eliza's skill with a needle, learned in the Whitaker sewing room during long evenings of mending fine clothes for her mistress, proved invaluable. Mrs. Richter asked few questions, satisfied with the story of a freed woman seeking honest work. For the first time, Eliza earned wages for her labor, and each coin she received felt like a piece of her humanity restored. She rented a room in a respectable boarding house, modest but her own. Each evening she returned to a space that belonged to no one else, with a bed that could not be taken from her, a lock on the door that answered only to her hand. It was a freedom so simple, yet so profound it often brought her to tears when she sat alone by the window, watching the city lamps flicker. But the shadow of the past was never far. Newspapers carried notices of fugitives, descriptions written with chilling precision. And then, 3 months after her arrival, Eliza's heart nearly stopped as her eyes fell on one such notice posted in a public square. A young woman of about 17, of medium height, with a small scar on her left wrist. The description was hers in every detail. The notice claimed she had murdered the Whitaker family, locking them in their icehouse to freeze, and now faced charges of murder as well as flight. The reward for her capture was an astonishing $700, a sum large enough to set professional slave hunters scouring every corner of Missouri. Reading the words, Eliza felt the ground tilt beneath her. She had gone from fugitive to accused killer, transformed by ink into a figure of dread and outrage. Even those who might have pitied a runaway slave would hesitate to shelter someone branded as a murderer of white children. She folded the newspaper quietly, tucked it under her coat, and walked away without a trace of reaction. Inside, her blood ran cold. She understood in that moment that St. Louis could no longer hold her. That evening, Eliza sat in her small rented room, the newspaper unfolded on the table before her, its words glowing in the lamplight like a sentence carved into stone. Wanted, runaway slave girl, 17 years of age, accused of murdering the Whitaker family. The reward of $700 was printed in bold type, enough to tempt not just professional hunters but neighbors, co-workers, even strangers in the street. She stared at the description of herself, the scar on her wrist, the details of her appearance, realizing there was no corner of the city where she could hide for long. St. Louis was not a sanctuary but a trap, its crowded streets full of eyes that might recognize her. Mrs. Richter noticed her unease the next day. The German seamstress had a quiet wisdom born of years of struggle, and she recognized the signs of a woman fleeing shadows. Without pressing for details, she offered Eliza quiet counsel. There were families traveling north who might take her along, posing as a servant. Wisconsin territory was growing, she said, a land where slavery had never been law, where a woman could live without chains. Eliza listened, hope flickering even as fear gnawed at her. The idea of leaving once again, of abandoning the fragile safety she had built, was terrifying. But the alternative was worse. To stay meant discovery. Discovery meant death. Within a week, arrangements were made. A family of German immigrants preparing to journey to Wisconsin agreed to let Eliza join them. She would ride in their wagon, tending to their children, presented as their hired help. The family's papers would list her employment, lending her presence legitimacy. They asked no questions about her past, only nodding with quiet understanding. Perhaps they saw in her the same hunger for freedom that had once driven them from their homeland. When the wagon train left St. Louis, carrying 15 families across muddy roads toward the frontier, Eliza sat among them, her head lowered beneath a simple bonnet. Every bump of the wagon, every creak of its wooden frame, carried her farther from the notices nailed to city posts, farther from the icy tomb of the Whitakers, and closer to a place where she could truly breathe. She worked alongside the German women, cooking meals over campfires, rocking restless infants, mending torn clothing. In their company, she found a fragile peace. They treated her not as property, but as part of their traveling household, offering kindness without the chains of obligation. The journey northward stretched for weeks, the land gradually softening from winter's grip into the muddy thaw of spring. Eliza watched the forests of Illinois give way to the rolling fields of Wisconsin territory, each mile lightening the burden on her shoulders. She did not speak of her past, nor did they ask. In silence, she carried her secret, the icehouse, the screams, the stillness that had followed. But in her heart, she carried something else as well, the fragile beginnings of freedom. Wisconsin Territory in 1838 was a place of rough cabins, endless forests, and wide rivers that seemed to stretch into infinity. It lacked the polished cruelty of the Louisiana plantations or the bustling watchfulness of St. Louis. Instead, it offered anonymity, the freedom to disappear into a land too vast and untamed for questions. For Eliza, the frontier was not simply a destination, but a rebirth. The German family who had sheltered her continued their journey to a farming settlement, and Eliza parted ways with them with gratitude. She carried their kindness in her memory, but she knew her path could not remain tied to theirs. She needed to build a life under her new name, Elizabeth Washington, one that could withstand scrutiny and last beyond fleeting disguises. With a portion of her remaining gold, she secured lodging in a boarding house in Milwaukee, a young city rising at the edge of Lake Michigan. Life in Milwaukee was harsher in some ways, yet freer in every measure that mattered. Work was plentiful for a woman skilled with her hands. She found employment first in a laundry, then as a seamstress, her nimble stitches earning the admiration of clients who had no reason to suspect the depth of her secret. She attended church services where no one forced her to the back pews, and for the first time she chose her own seat, lifting her voice in hymns without fear of rebuke. Each small freedom felt monumental, buying bread with her own coins, walking down a street unaccompanied, locking her own door at night. Still, the shadows followed. Occasionally, travelers from the south passed through town, bringing news of distant places. Once in a crowded tavern, she overheard mention of the Whitaker family, spoken with the blend of gossip and horror reserved for tragedies. Frozen together in their icehouse, a man said, shaking his head. Some say the slave girl did it. Others call it an accident, God's judgment on their sins. Eliza turned her face away, her hands trembling beneath the table. The story had already taken on the shape of legend, a tale retold by men who knew nothing of the truth, their voices weaving myth around the sharp reality of that night. She lived quietly, never staying too long in one place, always mindful of strangers who lingered too long with their gaze. Yet the years passed, and the pursuit never came. The reward notice grew yellow with age on southern tavern walls, the memory of the Whitakers fading into whispers, while Eliza's life stretched forward in the north. With discipline and care, she cultivated her new identity until it no longer felt like a disguise. Elizabeth Washington became her truth, while Eliza Monroe slipped into memory like a shadow she no longer claimed. But the icehouse never left her. In the stillness of night, she would sometimes wake, breathless, hearing faint echoes of fists pounding against wood, shrill voices demanding release. Freedom was hers, yet it came tethered to ghosts that would never be silent. By the early 1840s, Elizabeth Washington had become a quiet fixture in Milwaukee. She ran a small sewing business from her rented room, taking in mending and tailoring for dock workers, shopkeepers' wives, and eventually even the wealthier families who wanted her careful handiwork. She saved every coin, living modestly but with a sense of dignity she had never known in Louisiana. people began to recognize her as a reliable woman, steady, discreet, trustworthy. Neighbors called her Miss Washington with the respect owed to a free woman, and for the first time in her life, she belonged somewhere not by force but by choice. But while her life in the North grew stronger, in the South her name had been twisted into legend. Stories of the Whitakers' deaths traveled upriver with traders and across counties with gossip. Some claimed the family had been punished by God, their cruelty answered with divine frost. Others swore it was the work of witchcraft, that Eliza Monroe had called upon spirits of the dead to seal her masters in ice. Children whispered of the Ice Witch of Louisiana, a figure who haunted frozen cellars and lured cruel masters to their doom. Every retelling exaggerated the tale, stripping away the truth and replacing it with superstition. Eliza heard fragments of these stories whenever travelers passed through Milwaukee. Once in the marketplace, she paused near a group of men trading tobacco, listening as one recounted the Whitaker tragedy. His voice carried a mix of fear and admiration. "They say the girl never ran," he told his companions, "but that she walked still, unseen, with winter at her heels." Eliza turned away, concealing her face beneath her bonnet. To them, she was a phantom. To herself, she was simply a woman trying to live quietly. Yet she could not help but wonder at the strange power of it all. Her act, born of desperation and survival, had become myth, a story that traveled farther than she ever could. Perhaps that was its own kind of justice. The Whitakers, who had built their wealth on erasing the humanity of others, had been erased themselves, not only from life, but from the comfort of remembrance. No gravestones marked their names, no sermons praised their memory. What remained was Eliza's defiance, carried like fire on the breath of storytellers. Still, she never revealed her truth to anyone. Not to the women she worked beside, not to the preacher whose sermons she attended, not even to the rare friends who invited her to share meals. To speak it aloud was to risk discovery, to invite hunters who might still pursue her across decades. Silence was her armor. Only in her private prayers did she give thanks for the strength to survive that night, and only in her nightmares did she relive the screams muffled by stone and snow. By the 1850s, Elizabeth Washington was no longer the frightened girl who had fled Louisiana on horseback. She was a woman in her 30s, established in her trade, respected in her neighborhood, and known for her quiet strength. The North was changing, swelling with new immigrants, railroads, and industry. Yet the South's shadow stretched long, and Eliza felt it every time a fugitive notice appeared on city walls or a newspaper carried stories of political fights over slavery. She had survived by silence and careful distance, but the world around her was boiling toward conflict. She could not escape the whispers of her own myth. The Ice Witch of Louisiana story traveled like wildfire in abolitionist circles. Pamphlets printed in Boston and Philadelphia carried embellished versions of the tale, framing it as a symbol of resistance. Some writers claimed the girl's act was not merely vengeance, but prophecy, proof that slavery's cruelty would one day devour itself. They painted Eliza as a fearless heroine, though they never knew her true name, nor that she sat quietly in Milwaukee reading their words with trembling hands. She often wondered how she should feel. Pride flickered in her chest when she saw abolitionists using her story to rally against slavery. Yet fear coiled beside it, for every pamphlet that glorified her act also risked bringing hunters closer. She lived in constant balance, between anonymity and legacy, between the ordinary woman she had become and the legend that walked beside her like a shadow. As the decade darkened, she took cautious steps to prepare for what might come. She moved her savings into discreet accounts under the name Elizabeth Washington. She purchased a modest home, a weathered two-story house with a garden that became her refuge. There she planted herbs, flowers, and vegetables, enjoying the quiet labor of watching something grow under her own care, free from overseers and lash. To her neighbors, she was simply a respected seamstress who had built a life through diligence. To herself, she was proof that survival was possible. But the country was changing too quickly for comfort. In 1857, she overheard heated arguments in taverns and markets and, after the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision, declared that black people, free or enslaved, had no rights the white man was bound to respect. For days, Eliza walked the city streets with a cold weight in her chest. reminded that her hard-won life could be stripped away by a law she had no voice to contest. The world was fragile, and her safety was never absolute. Still, she endured. And as the 1860s approached, she began to sense that the storm building between North and South might one day sweep away the institution that had shaped every moment of her youth. Whether she lived to see it, she did not know. But in the quiet of her home, she prayed for a reckoning. She prayed for a day when no child would be born to chains, no woman dragged to an icehouse for punishment. She prayed, too, for the souls of the Whitakers, not with forgiveness, but with the weary acknowledgement that their cruelty had forged the fire of her resistance. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Milwaukee buzzed with the fervor of enlistment rallies, marching bands, and speeches on courthouse steps. Young men in uniforms paraded down the streets, while women sewed banners and prepared medical supplies. For Elizabeth Washington, now in her 40s, the war felt like the breaking of a fever. The disease of slavery, festering for centuries, had finally driven the nation into open conflict. She followed the news with quiet intensity, reading newspapers aloud by candlelight, tracking battles along the Mississippi and beyond. Each victory for the Union carried with it the possibility that the institution which had stolen her childhood might collapse forever. Her story, meanwhile, grew louder than ever. Soldiers passing through the city told versions of the ice witch of Louisiana around campfires, embellishing it with every telling. Some said the girl had locked her masters in the ice house and then disappeared into the storm, leaving behind only a bloody shawl. Others swore she rode north on a horse made of shadows, guided by spirits of the enslaved dead. Abolitionist lecturers invoked her tale on stages across the North, holding her up as a symbol of righteous vengeance. To many, she became a ghostly heroine, part woman, part myth, living proof that resistance could strike even in the darkest places. Eliza listened to these retellings with conflicted heart. In their voices, she heard admiration, even reverence. But she also heard distortion. The truth of that night, the cold bite of the storm, the terror in her chest, the sound of children's cries fading in the frozen dark. Those details belonged to her alone. The world had taken her act and reshaped it into legend, stripping away its human weight. She carried the burden silently, never correcting the stories, never claiming her name. It was safer that way. Safer, too, for her soul to let the myth stand in place of her own scarred memory. As the war raged on, Milwaukee became a hub of activity. Eliza sewed uniforms for Union soldiers, her nimble fingers stitching the fabric of a new nation. She donated quietly to relief efforts, slipping coins into church collections that funded medical supplies. In small ways, she contributed to the war that was reshaping history, though no one knew the fire that burned within her. When Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, Eliza sat by her window and wept silently. Though it did not free all, it was a signal that the tide had turned. She thought of old Sarah back in Louisiana, of the enslaved children who had grown under her care, of the nameless men and women buried in unmarked graves. She prayed that they would know freedom, if not in life, then in the spirit carried forward by the living. And she thought, too, of the Whitakers, sealed forever in their ice house, their name fading into obscurity while hers, though hidden, lived on in whispers. By the war's end, Eliza had become an older woman, her hair streaked with gray, her hands calloused but steady. She had survived where others had not. She had built a life where none was meant to exist. And though the world outside cheered the end of slavery, she remained silent, her truth still buried. She knew her survival depended on it. Yet in quiet moments, when the city slept and the lake lay still under the moon, she allowed herself to breathe freely, as if the chains had finally fallen from her shoulders. Reconstruction reshaped the nation in uneven strokes. In the South, chains had been broken, yet new shackles of law and violence replaced them. Freedmen sought land, education, and dignity, while former masters clung to power with bitterness and bloodshed. From Milwaukee, Elizabeth Washington followed these events through newspapers and sermons, her heart torn between pride and sorrow. She rejoiced that the institution that had defined her youth was gone in law, but she mourned the cruelty that persisted, the lynchings, the massacres, the whispers of a new slavery rising under different names. In her own life, she had grown into a respected elder of her neighborhood. Her sewing business expanded into a small shop where younger women came to learn from her needlework. She paid them wages, fair ones, and insisted they keep part of their earnings for themselves. To them, she was Miss Washington, stern but kind, a woman of dignity who had come from the South and built something from nothing. They never suspected the full truth of her past. She was careful to reveal little, offering only fragments that explained her presence, without opening doors to suspicion. Yet her story lived on around her, divorced from her identity. The Ice Witch of Louisiana had become a ghost tale by the 1870s, told in Southern kitchens and Northern parlors alike. Some said she haunted ice houses, her breath freezing the locks so no door could open against her will. Others claimed she traveled from plantation to plantation, striking down cruel masters with frost that seeped into their bones. In Mississippi and Louisiana, former slaves told the tale as a warning and a promise. Cruelty would not go unanswered. Children grew up hearing it whispered by elders as proof that resistance was possible, even in the darkest night. Eliza never corrected them. Sometimes, sitting by her hearth with her mending in her lap, she overheard the younger women who worked for her trade versions of the legend with hushed excitement. She would smile faintly, though whether in pride or sorrow, even she could not say. The truth was hers alone, locked away like the chamber where her masters had perished. The world no longer needed her confession. It needed the myth more than it needed the woman. As the years passed, she aged with quiet grace. Her hair silvered, her back bent slightly, yet her hands remained steady with the needle. Neighbors came to her for counsel as much as for clothing, seeing her as a pillar of wisdom in their community. Few ever guessed the weight she carried, the burden of memory that never fully loosened. At night, when the wind rattled her shutters and the lake froze along its shore, she sometimes woke with her heart racing, convinced she heard again the muffled fists against wood, the fading cries from the ice house. Those ghosts never left her, but by day, she lived as Elizabeth Washington, a free woman who had made herself anew. By the 1880s, Elizabeth Washington was an old woman, her once dark hair now a crown of silver, her steps slowed but steady. Milwaukee had grown around her, railroads slicing through the city, factories churning smoke into the sky, neighborhoods expanding with new arrivals from Europe. She watched children she had once mended clothes for grow into adults with families of their own, while her own small shop endured, a quiet anchor in a changing world. To those who knew her, she was a woman of uncommon dignity, a matriarch without children of her own, but beloved by many. Her past was now a lifetime behind her, but it was never forgotten. In the South, the legend of the Ice Witch of Louisiana persisted. Writers began collecting folklore, and her story appeared in print alongside tales of swamp spirits, haunted plantations, and omens carried by owls. The details had shifted beyond recognition. Some claimed she was a conjure woman, others that she had been a wronged wife rather than a slave, still others that she vanished into the storm and froze with the Whitakers herself. Each retelling buried the truth deeper, but also ensured it would never vanish. Eliza had become both invisible and immortal. In her quiet home, she reflected often on that paradox. She had lived more than 4 decades under the name Elizabeth Washington, respected, ordinary, safe. Yet her truest self, Eliza Monroe, the enslaved girl who had turned an ice house into a grave, was remembered by strangers who would never know her face. She sometimes wondered if that was God's justice, that the Whitakers' cruelty would be reduced to a footnote, while her defiance lived on in stories told long after her death. As her strength waned, she spent more time by the window, watching snow fall across the lake, the flakes drifting down like silent echoes of that night so many years ago. She did not fear death. She had already defied it once, snatching her life back from the frozen tomb meant for her. When neighbors visited, she greeted them warmly, offering tea, advice, or a scrap of wisdom stitched into her words like thread into fabric. But when she was alone, she prayed quietly, thanking God for carrying her through and asking forgiveness, not for what she had done, but for the shadows it had left upon her soul. By then, she was one of the last living links to a generation born in chains. Young black men and women in Milwaukee knew slavery only through stories, yet they looked at her with reverence, sensing she carried something unspoken. They would never know the full truth, but they felt the weight of it, as if her silence itself testified to survival. Elizabeth Washington passed quietly in the winter of 1892. Neighbors found her in her bed, hands folded, her face calm as though she had simply drifted into sleep. She was in her early 70s, her exact birth year uncertain, for it had never been recorded. The community mourned her deeply. At her funeral, the church filled with those who had known her as a seamstress, a mentor, and a figure of quiet strength. They spoke of her generosity, her dignity, and her unshakable spirit. None of them knew the name Eliza Monroe. None of them guessed that the woman they buried had once been hunted across the South as a fugitive and branded a killer. Her grave bore the simple inscription, Elizabeth Washington, beloved friend and neighbor. To the world around her, that was who she had been. Yet beyond Milwaukee, the legend of the Ice Witch of Louisiana only grew. Folklorists collected it alongside other tales of resistance, marveling at how one enslaved girl had turned her master's cruelty into his grave. The story was retold in countless variations, sometimes tragic, sometimes triumphant, always haunting. Children whispered it at night, preachers invoked it as a parable of divine justice, and scholars puzzled over whether the tale was fact or fable. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Eliza Monroe had lived, had suffered, had chosen a moment of terrifying defiance, and had survived to build a life out of its ashes. The Whitakers, whose power had once seemed absolute, were gone, their wealth scattered, their name remembered only through the myth of their frozen deaths. In the end, the girl they had sought to destroy erased them not only from life, but from history. And so, long after her passing, the world remembered her, not by the name she carried to her grave, but by the shadow she left on a frozen Louisiana night in 1838. Eliza Monroe became more than a woman. She became a story, a warning, a testament, a whisper on winter winds reminding the living that even the powerless can rise, that cruelty carries its own punishment, and that freedom sometimes comes at the cost of blood and ice.